How to reverse engineer the masters. So this is a really interesting topic, and it's really important and applicable to your artwork, because once you understand how to break down a master's work, you can become such a better painter because of it. Now, all the masters did master studies themselves, as we're going to see later, like Sargent, Sorolla, all this other stuff. And by breaking things down to simple concepts and really analyzing how the collective wisdom of the past accomplished what they did, and then you can just, take that and apply it to your own artwork, you can really go fast and far with it. So let's get right into it. I'm going to be breaking everything down into art fundamentals so that you can understand things better. Now, when somebody goes into a master study, a lot of the time, they'll just be very overwhelmed. Because if you look at this painting, for example, by Sorolla, this portrait, then you can see that there's colors and there's edges and there's textures and there's values and all this other stuff, and it can be very daunting. Now, the way that you can actually understand why things look the way they do, or why certain artists get the accolades that they have, you need to break everything down into art fundamentals. So if we look at the art fundamentals of value, edge, texture, shape, and a bunch of other stuff. There's plenty more, but these are the big ones we're going to be talking about. And then we're also going to be mentioning something called medium, which, means different things in different circles. It can mean linseed oil, whatever you're putting into your paint, but it can also mean what type of material you're using, as in oil, charcoal, dry medium, whatever. But medium, we're going to talk about, it's going to be relevant later. And we're going to talk about the interplay of all of these and how the masters use it. And hopefully you can understand a few of the collective tricks that a lot of masters use across different sort of artists, time periods, whatever. Successful art uses very similar tricks because you're dealing with the same system, which is just human psychology. And on top of that, you're going to probably understand how to actually break down master studies yourself and learn your own unique things that maybe nobody has ever seen before or thought about. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the relationship between value and edge, because I don't see nearly enough people talking about this, and it's so critical because you see it repeated over and over and over again between different artists, different time periods. And it's if you can grasp this one concept, it will make your paintings instantly better. And I don't mean that in some sort of clickbaity, get rich quick sort of way. That's factually accurate. I've seen it happen to myself and others and whatever. It's very important to understand. And I'm going to show you originally just a little study here, and it'll illustrate my point. So if we grab these 4 boxes and we make one of the boxes very dark, and then we make one of the boxes not so dark. And this is just using some cross-hatching, but you can see that this is darker, that's lighter, right? Which one looks sharper is what I should ask. Which one looks like it's more in focus? Which one looks more like calls more attention? So it's going to be this one, right? And the reason for that is not because the edge is any blurrier. The edge I could change, of course, like let's say we have this, right? I could change the edge, fray it a little bit, and make it a little more softer. But that's not what's happening here. That's not why it looks more in focus or sharp. It's actually just because the bigger the difference between different values, the more contrast something has, the more sharper it's going to be. Now, you might be saying, okay, Chad, I understand what you're saying, but how is this relevant? You drew 4 boxes. How is this going to make my paintings better? Well, if you look at this painting right here, for example, you can see that the external elements of the painting don't have a lot of contrast in them. The entire thing is very abstract, and it's easier to see that way when things are abstract because they're simpler. They don't look like a nose or a mouth or a face. But you can see that the difference in value in this and that, just peripherally around his face, is very, very subtle. Whereas the difference in value between the collar and his beard, for example, is seriously night and day. It's white and black. Now, what that does is that it mimics human perception in a very weird way. So if you just take a thought experiment with me, or at least a physical experiment, and you look up from your phone and you look at a random object in your room, when you're looking at the object, it's going to be very, very sharp. But without moving your eyes, think about the things that are peripheral from that object, your center line of focus. It's going to look very blurry peripherally. Now, we don't really think about it this way, but that's really how human vision works. We don't see everything precisely. There's a lot of resolution in the focal point, but peripherally everything just falls apart, and everything actually starts looking like this peripherally, like these abstract sort of shapes, these organic shapes. And what this is doing is that it's mimicking human perception because it makes all the edges harder, even though they're not really harder. So it's more of an illusion. But so many artists use this trick, and it's very useful. So now I bestow upon you. And just to prove my point here, I'm going to go into this Sargent book I have. So this is a good example. So in this Sargent painting right here, you can see that your eye's drawn immediately to her. Now, it's not because the edges are the sharpest here, that's why you'd think, you would be looking at this. But it's actually because of how much contrast there is. So just the contrast, not the edge work, actually draws the attention right to the subject. And good master painters always have a subject. They always have something that's the most important, and then they have the supplemental elements to the painting that illustrate the narrative more. But they always have one point that's the most important. And they use their colors, their textures, their shapes, their whatever, everything to draw attention towards that subject. And then they use the reverse of that. The more boring colors, the more boring textures, the less interesting lights. They use everything peripherally so that you don't want to look at that. And this difference, this pull and play, that's what masters are doing all the time. And that's illustrated through, in a microcosm, this one example. And this is just shown everywhere. This is why white collars actually look good. They're always shown in men's fashion, like the white collar in the suit look really good because it frames the face in this very sharp way, and it brings attention to the face. So that works in paintings as well, because you have this really dark composition and you have this giant white spot that brings attention towards the subject. So grasping this relationship between the values and the edges is critical because you see it so much. Another thing you really want to look at is texture and how it affects the edge of something, and how it also affects this sort of peripheral play of interest and non-interest. So this is going to get a little more complicated, but hopefully once I explain it, it'll make sense. So if you look at a lot of oil paintings from the masters, may that be Frazetta, Sargent, Sorolla, anyone, Abbott Thayer, doesn't matter. They're going to use a very similar sort of hand technique, the way that they're actually applying the medium onto the canvas. And by doing master studies, you're going to see all these kind of nuances start to pop up. And one thing you'll notice is that peripherally, everything is really scrubby. Now, that's not a very, art academic term, but I think it illustrates the point well enough. It's very, if that's even a word. But if you look at the peripheral elements here, everything's put in like that. And you see this more with Impressionist painters right after, the Realist painters, where everything was really sharp and everything looked worse, in fact. But when you have the peripheral elements and they're very scrubbed together, what it does is that some paint from basically the painting before you put the paint on top of it is still shown through it, because you're using these thinner, transparent sort of washes. And what that does is that you get a lot of details poking up from the bottom of the painting through the top of the painting. So when you're looking at it, you're seeing all the layers at once. And what that does is that it gives this kind of a look, and it looks detailed, like there's detail there, but when in reality there's actually no detail. And on top of that, so it mimics detail, that's one thing. And then on top of that, what it does is that it makes it not interesting, as in it makes it blurrier. Because when you're scrubbing something, when you're putting in a mark as a scrub, what happens is that the actual shape is different. So if we look at two different brush types, you're going to see this illustrated. So if we grab just a normal flathead sort of paintbrush, this is what a normal synthetic one would look like. Whereas if you had a hog hair, same sort of brush, it would have a lot more irregularity to it, the way that the actual hairs come out. And what this does is that this paintbrush would leave a mark more like this when you place down a shape onto the canvas. Whereas if you look at this kind of paintbrush, what it's going to do is that it's going to leave a shape more like that. And this might seem insignificant, right? Because it's so subtle. But the difference here is absolutely fundamental, because every master uses this, or at least almost every. I'm sure you could find one, that makes this mistake. But when you're using all the abstraction and the organic lines in the peripheral elements, what it does is that it makes the edge smoother without you even having to think about it, without you having to go in there and manually sort of blur it out. It makes everything look less sharp. And then what also happens is that if you use less paint, which you see a lot as well, you can see, I mean, just visually, there's less paint in this area versus this area. When you're using less paint, what happens is that you're placing the paint on it, but instead of, maybe if you use a lot of medium, it would make this sort of a shape. When you're using less paint, it kind of drags a little bit of paint and covers it, but it's in this very speckly sort of way. So a good example of this is in this close-up Sargent painting. This is a prime example of this. So you can see that when you're dragging it with not a lot of paint, because if you'd used a lot of medium and just very thick paint, like just titanium white right there, it would make a very specific shape like that. It would make this very boxy shape. Whereas Sargent didn't use it like this, right? So when you place it on, you can see that the burnt umber actually underwash here is poking through the canvas, and you get this kind of dotty speckly pattern. And what that does is that not only does it give an illusion of detail where you don't have to, like, you're not putting in every single speck, right? This is just one little line. It's really easy to put in this, but it gives the illusion of detail, but it also blurs it a little bit. Like the edge here is not sharp, right? When you're looking at this does not look sharp. It looks a little blurrier. And then what that does is that since everything's very relative in painting and drawing, or in general, in human psychology in general, your brain is just visually drawn to the sharper edges, which is of course around the face, and Sargent knew this. And by using these really, like the thinner paint and using the more texture and less contrast peripherally, it gives everything this out of focus kind of look, and it gives just the subject so much power and magnetism. Because when you have two things fighting for your attention, if he had done this sharp of an edge on this sort of stuff, then it would call out to you immediately, and then you would have this kind of conflict in the painting. And when you have a painting that's conflicting for your attention in two different spots, you don't want to be going there. That's not a good place to be. So you can see that just all over the place, these artists continually use these same tricks. I mean, if we go through more Sargent paintings, same thing right here. In the peripheral, he's scrubbing it in, like he's going like this, scrubbing it in, probably with more organic brushes. And it gives this kind of flickery, smoother sort of look to it, right? Whereas if you look at the subject, and maybe we can get a closer face here, right? Okay. When you're putting in the actual brushstrokes of a subject, and this is actually a Velasquez study, to go back to my earlier point, the master study masters, you have this very careful placement. Now it's still swift, right? It's still swift because there's almost nothing that's actually sharp anywhere. You shouldn't have a completely sharp line on your painting. It should be a little bit softer. You can get very near sharp, but it's the same as not using blown out white ever. You never want to use blown out white. You always want to keep your vocal ranges, so to say, just barely below the maximum because it shows this sort of restraint. And it's also more realistic because you never see blown out white, generally speaking, unless you walk into a very sunny, walk outside, for example, it's blown out. But anyway, when he's placing strokes on the face, which is the place of the subject, he's using carefuler, more placed strokes, and he's using a little more medium. And what that does is that it makes all the edges more sharp. Versus if you look at the background here, do you think he was placing in the background like that? No. He was scrubbing the hell out of it, right? I mean, everything here was just scrubbed, Do you think he was when he's putting in this red background, I think he was just manually, really carefully putting in? No. The actual way that you apply paint changes all of these art fundamentals. Same thing with Sorolla here, actually, in the Sargent book, funny enough. But if you look at this, contrast right here makes the edges look sharper. And then if you look at this chair, for example, on the brushwork, zoom in it real quick. I mean, that thing is just, that's not carefully placed at all. It's just, and a lot of people think that the kind of loose Sargent-y brushwork is just kind of a trick and it makes it look cool close up. But the reason why it works and it looks realistic is because it's not just for show. It's actually doing something. It's actually using an art fundamental, which is that edge and that value difference, and it's also mimicking detail. It's doing all these things at once. And unless you look at all your art fundamentals and you break it down by value, you break it down by edge, you break it down by color, whatever, you're never going to actually understand how these artists did all this. If you don't look closely at the painting, you imagine yourself placing the strokes yourself as if you were holding Sargent's brush, it's going to be more difficult for you to actually adopt all this power and all this knowledge that the past collectively had. So those are just a few examples and a few of the things I noticed. If you have any questions or you have anything that you'd like me to cover, any topic, you want to, let me know how your day was or whatever, just, leave me a comment down below. I love reading them. I love responding to them. And regardless of that, I hope that you guys learned something today. I hope that you have a good rest of your day and go make something beautiful. Have a good one. See ya.